Attollo, and I am super excited to introduce all of you to one of my best friends, JT Mullins, who is currently serving as a legal innovator at the Innocence Project. I just messed up your title. He is a legal fellow, but your formal title is Exoneration Innovator, which I think is pretty cool, and I wish he flexed that title just a little bit more. So I'm super excited that he's here with us. We were in grad school together over at Oxford, and so I'm happy that he's able to be with us from New York today. So to kick us off, I'm hoping you can tell us a little bit about where you're from and what some of your hobbies were growing up.
Yes, well, thank you for the introduction. And I prefer fellow, honestly. I think Exoneration Innovator makes me sound like some sort of Silicon Valley gargoyle. So I'm glad that you went with fellow. Thank you for the warm welcome, and thank you for having me. So yeah, I'm JT. I use he, him pronouns. I'm from Hershey, Pennsylvania, so not too far from here. Yeah, I was born and raised in Hershey. I guess I was born in Camp Hill, but it's neither here nor there. I went to Dairy Township School District, so in Hershey, from K through 12. Growing up, I played tennis. This is gonna be really embarrassing. So I played tennis, I played concert piano, I was in the Harrisburg Youth Symphony. I had like friends and stuff too, I promise. What else? I ran track and field through 8th grade. I was aggressively mediocre at it. Let's stop there. Let's stop there.
Awesome. So I would love to talk about some of the academic things that you did.
Please.
I know we don't harp on who you were as a high schooler. So after you graduated from high school, you then went to Yale for your undergrad, where you studied ethics, politics, and economics. And then after that, you got a Rhodes Scholarship and then did your master's in criminology at Oxford. So I'm curious, when you were in high school, when did questions about justice move from something that you were interested in to something that going into college you actively wanted to work on?
That's a good question. I feel like generally, I don't know how familiar like people are with Hershey. It's like a really cushy place to live. Great public schools, really great public infrastructure. Generally, I just felt like I had a really nice life growing up, and it wasn't something that I ever really took for granted. So my dad, who's here, grew up on the south side of Chicago with a single mom. My mom immigrated from Korea, and I saw how hard both of them worked to give me and my little brother lives that were secure and comfortable, where we could do really whatever we wanted. And this isn't really a luxury that most people are afforded, and I think that was something that they did a really good job of impressing on us really early. And so for me, it just always felt like the natural way to kind of like give back in a really general sense, given that I had been, just afforded so many opportunities to think of ways that I could use my talents, few as they are, to, make life better for other people. So that was a very general, like, I guess what you could call like a public service orientation. That later developed into sort of a broader political and professional practice as I grew older.
I think that's very humble of you to describe yourself as somebody with few talents. I know that to not be true, that you are a very, very talented person. And I think it's really beautiful the way that your family has impacted you and really shaped the way that you think about your responsibility to others and to community. And I'm curious if there was like a specific book or a class or something like that that really made you think, I really want to dedicate myself to working towards systems of justice.
I don't know that there was a specific book. My dad might be upset about that because he gave me a really long reading list when I was a kid. He had me read, I'm not gonna remember the name of this book, People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn, when I was like 13, way too young to be, well, maybe not way too young, but I felt way too young to be reading stuff like that. So I feel like getting like a critical education through books like that, I think was really pivotal in kind of, I don't know, developing a curriculum or an understanding of the world that's perhaps outside of the bounds of, Hershey's wonderful education. To return to your original question, I think that one of the books that kind of shaped my own political practice is Are Prisons Obsolete by Angela Davis, which is a book where she kind of challenges the idea that prisons are a natural part of human society, that we should be caging people for the things that they do. And yeah, I think for me, I mean, it's really well written. It's short, which I think is always good. And I think really gets at the core of what I think are some of the most important issues that we face today. I cannot believe I just used that phrase.
I definitely want to come back to talk a little bit more about your work around prison reform and abolitionist thinking in that regard. I just want to spend a little bit more time talking about your educational journey and sort of how you've gotten to the role that you have now. And I think one question that people might be wondering is, you went from Yale to study overseas, despite your work centering around the U.S. political landscape, U.S. prisons. So why pursue graduate study overseas? Why go somewhere else? And did being outside of the country shape the way you look at the U.S. and the problems facing the U.S.?
Yeah, so there were a couple reasons that when I was at the end of my undergrad, that I decided to try and go overseas. I'll be really candid here. The first is that I was really presented with kind of two options. One was to go work and get a job, and the other was to maybe have someone pay for me to go live in Europe for a couple of years. So the second sounded a little more appealing. But I also had to think like really critically about, like if this was something that I actually wanted to do. I have like people who ask me about applying to the scholarship, as I'm sure that you do. And I think one of my first pieces of advice is to, with all of the other things that come with something like this, I think you should also think about what it's going to practically mean for you to do it. Because at the end of the day, you're going to be on, in this case, like a rainy rock in the middle of the North Atlantic for 2 years, and there will be no Black people, and it will be, like it's your life. And so the reason that I decided to go abroad was because, at least for me, the next step kind of logically was law school. So I want to practice as an attorney. But I just didn't feel like I had the sort of life experience to do that. I didn't feel like I had the kind of critical perspectives to do that. So law school, as I understand it, is a vocational school, much like med school, for example. Like it's training you with a very specific set of skills to do a very specific job. What it often does not do as well is provide you with a sort of critical background. And so for me, given that the issues that I work on are also like deeply social and deeply political, I didn't feel like I had the kind of necessary other background to then also become a professional. So that's why I went grad school specifically. Why I went overseas is that I also think that the US is a very unique context. Especially if you're going to be talking about the criminal legal system. It's uniquely constructed around race and class in ways that are somewhat similar to other jurisdictions, but also markedly different. And so I think for me to have like a sort of outside perspective looking in was really helpful, but then also to kind of talk with scholars and practitioners and just generally people who came from different contexts, I think was really helpful for me to give me like new ideas, new perspectives on issues that for me are, I don't know, it can be hard to kind of question the things that you assume when everybody else around you is also living under the same set of assumptions. So a long-winded answer to a rather brief question.
I completely agree, though. I definitely had that experience of being in another context really makes you think differently about where you're from, and it allows you something to compare it to that I don't think you get when you stay in the same place your entire life journey, academic journey. And I think affords us a lot more freedom and flexibility in the research that we do and the questions that we're asking that I think right now it's been hard sometimes for people to find their footing in our current landscape. So the second journey that you're kind of on right now, before you still get to law school, like we did the graduate school and now we're in this really particular year of your life. And you're currently part of the Weil Legal Innovators Program in New York City. Which means that you applied to law school actually last year, a year ago, deferred your admission to take on this opportunity to be a legal fellow. Can you talk a little bit about what a fellowship actually is? Because I think it's probably a concept many of our students are unfamiliar with, and why somebody might choose that path rather than just continuing straight through school.
Yeah, so I was at a point last year where I'd applied to law school and I was again thinking about whether or not this was something that I like actually wanted to do in the fall, because I knew that I wanted to do it. It was just a question of whether or not I felt ready at that time. And kind of similarly to how I felt at the end of my undergrad, I just didn't feel like I had, in this case, the professional experience necessary to be the kind of attorney that I wanted to be, right? So as soon as I enter law school, 3 years later, I'm going to come out on the other end, practicing attorney. And I just honestly didn't feel like I was ready. Like I didn't have experience working in a law office for an extended period of time. I'd done like summer internships and stuff. But I think often what you'll find in a law office specifically, I mean, at least one with like a decent amount of staff, is that you'll be delegating a lot as an attorney. And for me, I didn't want to be delegating tasks that I hadn't performed. It just didn't feel like, I don't know, it didn't feel like I would be a very good manager if I didn't really understand the stuff that I was asking others to do. And then also I just wanted to spend more time. So in this case, I'm at like a larger nonprofit doing legal work. And I just wanted to see what an environment like that was like on a day-to-day basis for an extended period of time, longer than an internship. And so that's why I started thinking about deferring law school. What this fellowship actually is, fellow is a really broad term. A lot of places are going to use it. I think it often means that they're going to pay you not very much, if I'm honest, because it sounds really fancy. So for this specific fellowship, for the record, I'm being paid adequately. So this particular fellowship is for incoming law students who have already been accepted to law school, who want to spend time in public service. So there's 10 of us each year, placed at various nonprofits, and yeah, it's just a chance to like really explore the sector that you want to get into. And so for me, I applied because the Innocence Project was one of the organizations that's participating this year. I'm sure we'll talk about it more, but the Innocence Project works in like wrongful convictions. I've worked in criminal defense before. It's one of the handful of organizations that does the work that I care about that can also pay me a salary. I was going to say a good salary, just a salary in general. So yeah, I was really excited about this opportunity, and so that's why I decided to apply. Did that answer the question?
You're spot on, yeah. So let's talk about the work itself that you're doing right now. A lot of the work that you do focuses on abolitionist approaches to criminal legal reform, and just in general, like the role of lawyers when it comes to political organizing. For those who might be unfamiliar with abolitionist frameworks, how would you describe that approach when it comes to thinking about prison and criminal justice reform? And how does that differ from traditional reform efforts?
Yeah. All right, you're gonna have to walk with me here. So I think that abolition can be like a really scary word for people. I think often it's kind of thought of as this idea that we should close all prison doors tomorrow. I guess open them would be a better analogy. Just open them and let everybody out and see what happens. That is not how I understand it. That's not how I think most people understand it. So for me, it starts from the place that everybody deserves to live a life that is safe and secure in a community that sees them as a human being. And so this comes with things like believing people have the right to food, water, shelter, but also security and safety and the conditions that actually allow us to live safe and secure lives. So to circle back to Hershey for a second, because I've been thinking about it, I think Hershey's a really great example of some of the things that people think about when they're thinking about an abolitionist future. So things like robust public education, things like healthcare system that is accessible and relatively affordable. I'm going to use relatively very strongly. And so I think using that as a starting point, places like prisons are antithetical to this sort of worldview. So the idea that someone who inflicts harm on another person suddenly becomes something less than human. They become something to be either shut away or corrected, or perhaps shut away in the name of correction. I think is antithetical to the idea that people are complex, that they are capable of change, that they're capable of committing harm, but also of being more than the worst thing that they've ever done, to quote Bryan Stevenson. And so using that as a starting point, at least the way that I see prison, they are institutions primarily of punishment and of warehousing. And I don't think that it's something that we as a society, one, should be doing just from like a moral standpoint. I don't think that the state should be actively inflicting harm on the people that it's supposed to be representing, the people that it's supposed to be made of. But I think equally importantly is that they don't work. Like they don't do the things that they're supposed to do, which if you're going to take like an efficiency argument, I think is really important, right? Like prisons are supposed to deter crime. I think most academic research has shown that prisons and lengthy sentencing doesn't deter crime. Another argument is that they're meant to reform people, that they're supposed to make them better and more prepared to re-enter society, which I also don't buy. For one, because a lot of reform programs just simply do not work. They don't do the things that they're supposed to be doing. This is going to be a really long answer, and I'm just going to apologize in advance. So, for example, I've had clients who have been in prisons with no programming, yet programming is what they're supposed to have on their record to show that they're ready to re-enter society. And so if you're at a place that's supposed to be educating you and training for work, but it doesn't do either of those things, then I think it should lead us to question whether or not that place is actually supposed to be doing the thing that we say it's doing. To quote someone who I'm not going to remember, the purpose of a thing is what it does. So I think looking really critically at like institutions broadly is another way of approaching abolitionism. And then the final point that I had to make, I honestly don't remember. So I'll stop there because it's already getting a little long.
We'll come back to it. Yeah. I really love that quote that you can't identify with a person.
Yeah,
but
my apologies to whoever said it.
But the purpose of a thing is what it does. And you said in more words that prisons don't work, in your opinion, right? And so one of the ways that we see prisons and our criminal justice system broadly not working is when we think about wrongful conviction sort of work, right? So people who are tried and convicted for crimes that they ultimately did not commit, and that is the work of the Innocence Project, right? Is to clear the names, offer some form of repayment retribution to the people that have been wrongfully convicted. And so in your particular work as the exoneration innovator, from my understanding, you're supporting the post-conviction litigation team, and you're doing research and writing, resource guides, working directly with clients. I know you were just on the phone with somebody right before we started this. How does your work in particular help advance the mission of freeing those who have been wrongfully convicted, and what part of that process do you find most rewarding?
Yeah, so I think to start, I want to make like a distinction. Because I feel like often when we talk about places like the Innocence Project, there can be sort of like an implication that I like to avoid. So the idea that the only people who don't deserve to be in prison are people who have not actually committed crimes, and just like I don't think that's true, and I don't think that that's like a helpful stance to adopt. The idea that if the justice system were functioning perfectly, and we were only convicting people who had done the things that they've been convicted of, then we should feel great about that. Kind of harkening back to my last answer, I would challenge that. So that's like as a baseline. But yeah, so I guess my work is varied. I think in large part because as a fellow, which is a very nebulous job description, I kind of see my job as like a trash can. My supervisor hates when I say this, but I genuinely mean this and with like no ill will. So you'll often find it like large nonprofits or even, I don't know, like those of you who work at Attollo, I'm sure that you also can feel this way. There are really tight resource constraints, and there's always more work than there are people who can do it. And so for me, coming in on a year-long contract, I know that I can't be there. Like there's a set limit to when I'm there. And so I think that the best thing that I can bring is like my mind and my capabilities, like my ability to clock in and do work. So the reason that I think of myself as a trash can is because I do the stuff that like people don't have the time or the energy to do, to kind of keep picking up slack wherever it exists to advance cases. And so to return to your original question, it's really just like whatever work needs doing. So right now I'm working on a couple of applications for a couple of clients who are applying for clemency in Pennsylvania. I recently got through many thousands of pages of medical documents that one of our clients had because we needed just like a summary of their conditions. Sometimes I'm checking citations. I was just on the phone with a client who we chat every week. both about his case, but then also just kind of like generally catching up. He's an Eagles fan, so we always have a lot to talk about. So yeah, it's really varied, and I think this is like a really important approach for people, especially at our stage in our career, to take, because no matter how great I think I am, I'm very aware of the fact that like I don't have, like I said, a lot of professional experience. I'm 24, soon to be 25, Christ. And I think like truly the best thing that I have to offer is like my time and my energy. And I think that's a really helpful way to approach any sort of work. The most meaningful part is, one, getting to advance clients' cases. And so I know there are a couple of cases that all else equal, if I wasn't here, they would not have been advanced as incrementally as they've been advanced by my presence. So that makes me really happy. And then also just getting to connect with my clients on like a really human way. So all of my clients are incarcerated, or at least the vast majority are incarcerated. And a prison is just like a really terrible place. It's a place where like people don't feel like a full human being, where they don't feel like people both inside and outside see them as like a full person outside of their conviction. And so for me, like one of the best parts of the job, if not honestly the best part of the job, is just getting to like talk to my clients and connect with them on, a human level. Yeah, because I know how sort of life-changing that can be for somebody.
I really love what you opened with and clarified that, just seeing wrongful conviction as the sole evidence that the justice system doesn't work isn't enough, and that there's so much beyond that, even if that's like the lowest hanging fruit that we can grab to say, this does not work.
Like it's a problem.
It's
not the problem.
Yeah. There are many more, and I think what you brought up at the end, right, of people being dehumanized in this process, and that alone being enough of a factor to say this doesn't work. When people are losing their sense of humanity, we have lost the plot. We aren't doing what we're supposed to do, and I think one thing that the Innocence Project does pretty beautifully is blending legal strategy with advocacy, with storytelling, with human rights sort of work. And I'm curious for you, how does, even just like empathy alone play a role in your job as an advocate for people?
Yeah. Again, to kind of bring this back to like the way that an abolitionist politics informs my work, I think it has to come from a deep place of empathy, because at least like in Hershey, again, and with a lot of people that I know, a lot of people don't know people who have been to prison, who have had significant contact with the carceral system, or people who are in prison currently. And I want to be clear, this is not the case in a lot of communities, including a lot of the communities that my clients come from. But my personal experience, I've found this to be true, especially places like Yale and places like Oxford. And so I think it can often come as like, I don't know, like a shock, or it can be sort of jarring to people who come from these places, to think about people who are in prison as people. Because we are conditioned, one, to not really think about them at all. But then two, when we do think about them, you kind of get like orange jumpsuit, striped jumpsuit if you're real old-timey. Like just kind of like vague, dangerous person that probably should not be near me. And so I think when you have that notion challenged, or when you challenge it yourself, and you kind of like talk to people, in this case, like my clients, and like the client that I was just talking to, we've been complaining about the cold for the last, what feels like years. It's probably been like 2 months. We're talking about the books that we're reading, or we're talking about football, because like I said, big Eagles fans. I've got a couple Eagles fans, which is miserable for me. And yeah, I think like connecting with people on like a foundational level that is somewhat distinct from your kind of professional obligation to them, is a really, really important part of the work, because at least for me, that's also kind of what keeps me motivated. If I'm like sitting on my couch at home and I'm working from home, and like maybe I don't feel like working that hard, I think it's always like a helpful reminder that like there's a human being on the other end of this. Like it's not these tasks, however menial or sometimes, dare I say, boring, they are going in direct service of like a real person who is sitting somewhere in a facility right now. And it is your job, or you are part of a team whose job it is to try and win them their freedom. I think that always kind of emphasizes the gravity of the work that you're doing.
I really appreciate that. And I think really trying to remember the impact of the work that you do. I think in spite of when it may feel heavy, or you might feel tired, or feel inclined to not give it your all, I think remembering like who you do it for. I think we're working in very, very different sectors, but I've also, even working in the education sector, found that really helpful, right? Like remembering who the work is for, I think is a really, really motivating thing, especially when you're doing this sort of like nonprofit work where the work never ends and there's always something more that you can be doing to serve people. But I'm curious, we actually do have some students here today, and I'm really curious if, for those of them who might be interested in thinking about like justice or law or policy or like these sort of social impact careers, what are, one or two experiences that you think genuinely shape how people show up in this work? Or, are there experiences that students should be seeking out early on to prepare them to do work like this?
Yeah, I think that the first, kind of going back to my previous answer, is to, as much as possible, like get in contact with, the people that you want to serve. And I think this is just like sort of generally. So like if you want to work in education, then like go be a camp counselor, or like go volunteer at places where you are, as much as possible, directly exposed to the communities that you care about. I think this is also important because like a lot of us want to serve the communities that we come from. And so I think this is really helpful in just kind of like grounding yourself in work, especially because I think as a student, there can be sort of a pressure as you're applying to like college and scholarships and stuff to kind of, I don't know, paint yourself as like a general world saver. Like you're someone who is gonna like go out there and like change everything, which is great, but in a really vague sense. And I think that like that's a really great orientation. I think at some point it is going to have to get sort of narrowed to either like a specific like group of people or like set of issues, because you can't do everything. And so I think that like going out and exploring things and seeing what really resonates with you, there are a million things that you could be working on all the time. There are unfortunately a lot of problems. So you have to find what's personally motivating to you, and I think that's really distinct from what is important. I don't know if that makes sense. Because again, like I said, it has to be something that's going to get you out of bed every day. That's going to get you on that train to the office when it's -2 degrees out. That's going to get you to open your laptop on a Friday when no one's really watching. So I think finding those things that really speak to you is what's most important. Yeah.
I think that's a really helpful distinction, thinking about what personally motivates you versus what's important, because there's so many important things, right?
Yeah.
Like, and we as any individual cannot possibly even begin to do all of them. So I think I really appreciate that about find just something that makes you want to get up in the morning. And before I open it up to the audience for questions, I have just one more. Forward thinking a bit. So, when we're thinking about these like abolitionist frameworks, I think they're often asking us to imagine systems that don't currently exist, right? So when we talk about, prison abolition, right? This isn't actually something we have right now, right? We're not there. We cannot say we've abolished the prison system. You would not have a job if that was the case. I think that's one of the funny parts.
I'd love to not have a job.
I think that's one of the funny parts about nonprofit is we're often doing work that we actually hope doesn't exist one day. Like we are actively in spaces that we wish we didn't have to be in. But when you think about 10 years, maybe even, I'll give you 20 years, maybe 10's a bit tight. What do you think feels possible in terms of justice or public safety that we don't see yet or maybe doesn't feel possible today?
Yeah. I think one thing that's been really exciting for me is a sort of broader challenging of the idea that people cannot change. And I think that this idea is cemented by things like both the death penalty and life without parole, because they are functionally, I'm not going to say that they're the same. They're very similar because the state is, they're condemning you to die. And the reason that I say that I'm kind of hopeful about us challenging this idea is because we've been seeing over the last 10 years the introduction of second look acts, And so these are acts that let people, basically give people the opportunity to have their sentence re-examined regardless of the initial offense or the underlying offense. And so when I was working in DC for the public defender there in 2022, all of my clients had been convicted of the kind of stuff you get life in prison for. And there were no innocence claims, like they'd done it. And so the idea of these statutes is to be able to come back to the court and say, one, present mitigating factors. So like these are the situations, this is the situation that I was in at the time. These are the sort of underlying factors in the offense. They're not excuses, but they are context, and I think context is always really important. But then also, the second part, like recognizing people's capacity to grow. So I had a client who was released a couple years ago who he got sent up when he was 17, and he's in his 40s now. As people in this room can attest to, a lot of change happens between the ages of 17 and 40. It's not a profound statement, but I think it is something that is sort of profound in the context of like a life without parole sentence, because under a second look back, you can show up and say, listen, I did this thing, I own up to it, it caused a lot of harm, I sincerely regret it. I'm both the same person, but I am also different in many respects. And I deserve to be part of my community. I deserve the chance to contribute to my community. And so under DC law, the Incarceration Reduction Amendment Act, had like hundreds of people released. And as you can imagine, people were really antsy about the idea of letting people who committed really serious violent offenses back into their community. I mean, the Trump administration and the Trump DOJ was making a huge fuss about this from every stage, both from like the second the bill was introduced, all through, I'm sure they said something about it like today. The recidivism rate is next to nothing, which is unsurprising. I mean, one, it's really hard to get out of prison. Like, it's hard to prove to a judge by their standards that you are deserving of being let out. So the bar is also already really high, much too high. But through the sort of success of something like a second look, I think that it can challenge the idea that people cannot change, that people don't deserve a second chance. Because I think that actually is a really prevalent idea that we collectively as a society have right now. Like there are a lot of states, there are a lot of people who think that the death penalty is okay, that think that life without parole is okay, that think that there are things that people can do that are bad enough that you don't get a second chance. And so by showing that not only is that not true, but people who are given a second chance can actually have a really, really meaningful impact on their community, that's something that I'm really hopeful about us sort of beginning to internalize.
Thank you. I believe very, very firmly that people are deserving of a second chance, both from a sort of like philosophical perspective, but also from a spiritual perspective, all of it. So that I really resonate with that. And with that being said, I will open it up. I know we already got one question right here from the audience.
Hi, JT. I was wondering, in your time at the Innocence Project, what has been, I'm not going to say like the most, but one of the most interesting cases that you've gotten to work on, understanding that we won't get all the details?
Yeah, so interesting. I think that this is, I'll preface this by saying it's kind of a bummer. I work in wrongful conviction, so like everything's a bummer. But this is particularly going to be like a bit of a bummer. So apologies in advance. We have a client who was convicted of murdering a child that was in their care. And I'll just say her care, actually. I think gender is actually really important here, because one of the biggest factors, one of the biggest kinds of wrongful conviction that you see for women is of children that were in their care. And it's often like an accidental death. But one of the ways that sort of like gender dynamics and sexism can show up in courts is that women, unlike men, are presumed to have this sort of like supernatural caring capacity. And so when something goes wrong, when a child is on their watch, it's more often seen as not just their fault, but something that they did on purpose. And so this is what happened in this client's case. It's like truly egregious. It was obviously an accident. And so we've recently had like the medical examiner come back and say, like reverse their ruling from it being intentional to being an accident. The state brought in kind of bogus experts. I think that like the nitty gritty of the case isn't as important because it is just sort of like an open and shut accidental case. No crime occurred. But I think what's particularly relevant to our moment right now is that we won. So we got a ruling, I want to say 2 weeks ago. And what should have been a really big celebration is now actually a huge cause for concern because this client who was convicted in 2003 was undocumented. So entered the country without documentation. And so ICE has a standing order to pick up anybody who's released from prison. And so now we've run into an entirely separate group of issues that is particularly salient in this moment because we're not an immigration shop. We don't have, like, it's not our area of expertise, but all of a sudden this is a huge problem because we won this huge victory and we've gotten this ridiculous conviction vacated. But now we've run into this massive problem that our client, when they are released, could be picked up and shipped off to who knows where. And so I think that the reason that I bring this up is because I think it's a really important kind of example of how these sort of systems intersect. Because I think immigration is also like a huge issue. Like the criminalization of immigration and of undocumented people generally is a really big issue that like also fits under like an abolitionist worldview. And it's not an issue that I specifically work on, but since all of these systems of sort of oppression and state control are interlocking, all of our problems, like my specific problems, become other people's problems. I'll stop there. Yeah.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for being here today. I was wondering, kind of going back to the law school route, I know at least one, but maybe like a few others watching as well, who are in a pre-law program and they're juniors right now. And so you talked about not directly going into law school from undergrad. And I know to a lot of people that might be not the traditional pathway. So I was just wondering, was there any pressure or confusion from like friends or peers on like why you didn't just want to go straight in to law school? And then about yourself, did you ever like doubt yourself thinking that this was maybe the wrong thing and I should just go straight in? And how did you manage to kind of overcome and be okay with the decision of waiting a few years?
Yeah, it's a really thoughtful question. I think this kind of decision making comes from like knowing yourself, like a person. So I know that there are a lot of people, like I had a mentor who always harps on the idea that you should never take a gap year. Like he's the biggest opponent of big gap year. And his philosophy is like, you're going to lose motivation. You're going to lose momentum. You're going to kind of get trapped and sedimented in your regular life, and you're not going to want to go back to professional school. One, that was just not something that felt like resonant with me. I was like, I want to be an attorney, and there's only really one way to do that. So that, I mean, one, I think you should like take people's advice with like, not with like a grain of salt, but you should think about how it applies to you, if it does at all. But then when I was thinking about like this decision, it really just came down to, is this something that I feel ready for right now? And it's not that like I don't feel like I can do it. It's just, do I feel like I'm in a place that, do I feel like I'm in the best place to do it? And then again, kind of looking forward, when I come out on the other end and I actually have to go be an attorney, will I feel ready to do that as well? And so long as the answers to both of those were no, I felt very confident. So times that I doubted myself, honestly, not really. Especially because like, my life is great. Like I love not being in law school. I'm excited. Like it's going to be awesome, and I'm gonna get the training that I need to go do the things that I want to do. But also not being in school is wonderful, and I think also gives me a little bit of perspective for when I do eventually return to school. For the things that I kind of miss about being in school.
Thank you.
Walkable communities, friends right by, stuff like that. We have time for one more, yeah.
I just wanted to ask, you're going to law school in the fall, right? I wanted to ask you, how do you plan to balance your personal life and like well-being with the demands of law school? Because I know some of me and my friends, we're just really worried on how we're gonna balance like our social life and law school at the same time, because we know there's a lot of pressure to law school.
Yeah, I think that sort of a running theme through these sort of rambling answers is the idea that like people should be seen as full people. And so I think that this is a really important orientation to take into work and school as well, because you are a person outside of your capacity as like law student. I don't think that that should be like your primary idea of yourself, because I think that's sort of how we get trapped into this idea that like, if your primary function is to be a student, then anytime you're doing something that is not advancing that end, you're gonna feel like you're doing something wrong. So like when you skip doing a reading to go like hang out with your friends, not that you should do that like all the time, but I think it is okay actually like to do on like a semi-regular basis. And I think this has been sort of reinforced through time, both outside of school and then also when we were at Oxford when school was not, I mean, I was in school, but like it wasn't that, it wasn't a huge part of my everyday. Yeah, because like at the end of the day, you have to be like a human being outside of whatever else it is that you're doing. And so for me, what that's going to look like when I go to law school is like making sure that I'm keeping up with the things that are important to me. So the relationships in my life, like I'm going to be seeing my family, I'm going to be seeing my friends. I'm going to be, I just started playing the bass, I'm going to be playing the bass.
You should all follow his bass playing journey on Instagram.
Should not, it's not very good.
He told me not to plug the handle, but y'all can go find it.
Yeah, no, I'm making it private. Like I'll be watching movies, I'll be reading books. I'm going to be doing my best to kind of live life as like me, the entire person, while also recognizing that like law school is going to take up a significant amount of my time and energy. And I think it's like a tricky balancing act. I know I'm being kind of glib about it. It is hard, and there's a lot of external pressure too. Like law school especially can be somewhere where like there are really material differences when it comes to like your performance, right? Like there's a huge amount of like stratification and elitism, or like whatever you want to call it. Like it's a competitive environment. And so I think for anyone who's kind of thinking about that or struggling, I think you have to think about like whether or not what you're competing for is worth it. Like if it's actually that important to you that you would sacrifice other areas of your life. And maybe the answer to that is yes, but also maybe it's no. I just think it's an important question for you to think about either way.
Cool. So I just have one, maybe two more questions.
Yeah.
So we're talking about law school now. So what excites you about this next chapter, and what question are you maybe hoping to explore in law school that you haven't yet tackled or had the opportunity to really get into?
Yeah. What I'm really excited for is, I just keep harping on it. Like I'm excited to like be an attorney. Law is again like a very stratified and very like professional sphere, which is I think something that we should also take issue with. Like there's a lot of stuff that you can't do if you're not an attorney, which is not okay. But it is the world that we live in. And so there's a lot of stuff right now that I can't do because I'm not an attorney. So I'm excited to like have all of the sort of privilege, for lack of a better word, and like access that attorneys have. And also like the social kind of cachet to work on these sort of issues, because it's really important to me. And so that I'm really excited for. But that's sort of like, I guess, instrumental. In law school, what I'm excited for in law school.
Being back in New Haven.
Yes, I love
Shout out New Haven,
Connecticut.
Connecticut.
It's a wonderful city despite the fact they've gotten rid of their only movie theater. Which is a tragedy. I'm really excited to kind of like get in the weeds of the stuff that I like. I've been kicking this kind of can down the road, as you can tell, for a really long time. And like even when like sort of like statutory questions like come up at work, I'm like, I'll think about that later. Later's coming. So I'm excited to like actually kind of like develop the skills and like knowledge base that I think will serve me really well as I practice. I fear there was a second part to your question that I have neglected.
there's a question you're hoping to explore, but I think it's kind of wrapped up in that anyway. I think there are many things you're going to be asking and questioning and tackling.
Yeah, okay, I actually do I'll have a short answer to that. I think one thing that I'm really interested in is kind of complicating the attorney-client relationship. So I think I'm complaining about everything. Another problem with like the way that like the law works, specifically like criminal defense, is that you as the attorney are the person who kind of like has power and is seen as the expert, and your client is in many sort of castings just kind of like there, like there's someone who you are working on behalf of but not with, and I think that some of the most interesting like literature I've read on like public defense, or even just like some of the public defenders that I looked up to the most, are people who work with their clients, and so who are like talking with them about legal strategy, who are soliciting their input at like every step of the decision-making process. And the reason that I'm interested in exploring it is because it's like that's very non-traditional. You know, like a lot of people are like, well, I have all these fancy degrees. I went to this school that's supposed to, you know, spit me out as like the arbiter of sort of like this entire system. And so like, who are you to kind of tell me what to do, or to like give me your opinion? And I'm really interested in figuring out ways that like within this sort of like stratified and like hierarchical system, there we go, you can kind of level that playing field as someone who is afforded a lot of privilege. Yeah.
Beautiful. My last question, to just bring us home, I'm going to ask you, you have to keep this short. I know it's hard. If you could send just one message to our students in particular who might feel overwhelmed by just the scale of problems that they really care about, whether that's injustice related, policy, inequality related, any of it, what would you tell them to keep them moving forward?
I appreciate the reminder to keep it short. Perhaps a bit morbid, but I think that if the problems that you care about are big enough, which most of them are, you're not going to get it done in your lifetime, which is somewhat sobering, but at least for me also sort of like a relief in a way. Like these are really big systems that you're fighting against. They're really big problems that are sort of baked into the fabric of our society. And so you're not going to fix it by yourself. You're not going to fix it in the next couple of decades. Maybe you will. That would be awesome. Like maybe you will. But it's more likely than not that you won't. And so you should take it at your own pace. Like it's okay to take breaks. You should feel free to like step away. Like working 80 hours a week and burning yourself out over the next however long you can sustain that. If you can sustain that for 60 years, like it's still not going to get it done. So don't do it. So yeah, like at least for me, like whenever I feel like overwhelmed or like there's like I'm not doing enough, like whatever you are able to give, whatever you're able to contribute to the fights that you care about, that is enough. And you do your best work by like making sure that like you yourself are okay. I'll shut up now.
Heavy on that. Thank you, JT, for joining us. I'm really, really happy that you could be here and that I could introduce you to everyone here.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thank you.